Good morning and welcome to the Facebook studio at Raisina Dialogue. Today I've got Mr. Emerson Brooking with me. He's a resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, co-author of Like War, Weaponization of Social Media. And today that's exactly what we are going to talk about. Welcome to this live stream. It's good to have you here in New Delhi. I'm going to dive into a very basic questions. We all use social media. We've all been privy to the rise of terror groups such as Islamic State in the recent past that have used social media as a tool of recruitment and propaganda and so on and so forth pretty effectively. Are we still seeing social media as a social entity? Is it still the social part in the term social media? Does it still mean what it meant back in 2007 or 2006?
Well, unfortunately, what you describe is still a social phenomenon. Just happened to be a social phenomenon where actors with ill intent, actors that use political violence to achieve their objectives, realized that they could use social media toward their ends. When we talk about something like the rise of the Islamic State, it was using these new technologies so people with similar ideological background who came from very different countries could find each other and coordinate in a new way.
Right. So is it, the convergence of technology and terror is quickly sort of becoming a term in itself. So is it really a convergence of technology or terrorism, or is it more a convergence of technology and ideology? Because let's go beyond the rise of Islamic State. Even if we see something that happened in Christchurch in New Zealand. New Zealand had no history of terrorism before the Christchurch attack took place. So is it more run by ideology and not just sort of the big tent argument of terrorism?
I think what social media enables is you might once have had individuals who held a certain pernicious ideology that wasn't accepted in the cultural mainstream,
Right.
but they had no easy way to express it.
Right.
Even if you felt a certain way, as, say, the terrorists in Christchurch did, you couldn't readily find a community that shared your beliefs and would provide you moral and sometimes material support.
Right.
Now, if you hold any kind of belief, you can find a different group, or you can find a group who think and feel as you do. There are tons of terrorist examples. There are plenty of non-terroristic examples.
Right.
We see, for instance, the rise of the Flat Earth movement.
Right.
And tons of other related conspiracy theories.
Right.
There's essentially a new layer of ideological organization that lays atop states.
Right.
And that has profound consequences for the international system, and particularly when you're thinking about terroristic violence.
Of course. So let's come to sort of the solution part to this, if there is any. Of course, there are no quick solutions to this. We've seen both tech companies, governments try to rack their brains together to come and find a solution to these challenges. So where does the solution lie? Is it a technology problem? Is it a governance problem? Or is it a regulation problem?
We might approach each of those separately.
Right.
But I'd say one of the most surefire solutions that we've seen now is I've observed the U.S. trying to grapple with Islamic State over the last 4 years and the different steps we've taken.
Right.
You can't drive terrorists off the internet entirely.
Right.
They descend into deeper and deeper web sanctuaries, and there's a point at which you really can't get to them. But what you can do is limit the spread of their ideologies across broader social media platforms.
Right.
What made ISIS so scary and pernicious and effective wasn't the fact that they were online, it was the fact that they could reach out on these very public platforms via Twitter and Facebook and begin the process of radicalization of individuals who otherwise would not have gone down that path.
Right.
There's been a big pushback over the last few years. And I'll say, and I have an American perspective here, but I'm very leery of not regulation, but government legislation that attacks or attempts to curtail expression online.
Right.
Because we've seen passage of many fake news laws or counter-terror laws related specifically to online expression, and so far their utilization has been almost entirely to attack political dissidents within a particular country.
Right. So is it possible, or is it one of the things that technology companies specifically, along with the governments, look at, because as you said, social media is an open platform, it's very difficult to regulate. So if these groups specifically are holed into the deep web, for example, where you, me, and a lot of people watching this live stream do not access every day, is that still a consolidatory win if that is seen as a possibility where we could allow these kind of actors to exist? Because as you said, it just eradicating them from the online sphere is not really an option.
Yeah. Well, I'll say first, when you're talking about policy, there's no clear win. Obviously, the
Right.
clear win would have them being off these platforms.
Of course, yeah.
But when you're choosing between a number of options and lesser evils, I think it's best to have them in these deepest sanctuaries
Right.
where they can't readily reach the online public, but
Right.
more importantly, you can monitor them.
One of them,
If
absolutely.
they're together in that smaller online sanctuary, it becomes much easier for intelligence analysts and law enforcement to be tracking these communities and to try to head off any potential
Right.
violence as they try to organize.
Right. And let me bring up a more sort of scary question from an answers perspective of this problem, which is the word regulation. You know, tech companies are wary of it, civil rights groups are wary of it, because the internet is largely seen now as a human right. It's even the Indian court came out with a similar judgment here a couple of days back. And regulation is something that a lot of people have talked about, whether you allow anonymous accounts to exist on social media platforms and so on and so forth. So where are you on this debate? Is the internet even an entity that can be regulated before it should be regulated?
Oh, I think the internet absolutely can be regulated. I think even in the US, there's been a marked shift in the perspective of legislators. There's a general agreement that these companies should see much stronger public regulation because they have such disproportionate political impact. It's only fair to the public that they're the ones who ultimately have some control over
Right.
the policies of these companies.
Right.
But you have to be very deliberate in how you do it. Many proposals, for instance, banning anonymized accounts, might disproportionately affect people in countries less free, who don't
Absolutely.
have the same latitude to publicly express their opposition to the government. So we have to be careful with the policies we pursue, and you have to often differentiate between a government law and then government pressure.
Right. And we've seen examples of this in Syria, for example, accounts like Mosul Eye, that became very popular of tweeting out everyday stories from Mosul while it was being bombed, and was able to do it because it was an anonymous account and no one knew who was behind it. So
Right.
that of course comes into play. And probably the final question here, what do you think is now the next step of where we are today? It's a very confused debate right now. What's the next step that can make the online sphere much safer for you, me, and the general population? And this entire narrative of now that the terrorists may have got the better of our technology is allowed to sort of run away with it.
Yeah. I think there needs to be a shift in general philosophy when you're talking about online expression. The internet came up in a very regulatory lax environment.
Yeah.
It was commercialized early in the United States, and it's been largely a US perspective on free speech which has suffused the extent to which internet can be regulated.
Right.
And that's the case in the United States. I think moving forward, you are going to have to understand that online expression, there should be more rights for individuals to use these platforms and not feel harassed or endangered. That online expression, because particular hateful speech can spread so rapidly, can reach tens of millions of people, can reach it absent any fact check or countervailing points of view, that it poses unique harms and dangers that speech in the town square, where you're in a physical environment and somewhat accountable to the things you say, that there are fundamental differences between these two types of speech.
Right.
And I think one of our great responsibilities as we look 5 or 10 years ahead will be trying to figure out how best to protect the users of these platforms.
And I think that's some great food for thought on a very difficult issue that faces us in the coming decade as well. Thanks so much for joining us today at Facebook.
Thank you.